Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. Can someone read the announcement?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank
A
you.
news release announcing the date, time, and place of the April 4th, 2019 Policy Committee meeting was distributed on April 3rd, 2019 to appropriate media and other groups of individuals who have requested notification. The announcement and agenda were posted at the Department of Disabilities and Special Needs Central Administrative Office and on its website. Americans with Disabilities Act. The public has been notified that accommodations such as interpreters, mobility assistance, and other assistance will be provided to individuals with disabilities and special needs if requested in advance.
Okay, thank you. Does everybody have a copy of the agenda? Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
So moved.
Commissioner Thompson, this is Susan. I would just like to make one recommendation and perhaps suggest an amendment to the agenda as far as an order of items. According to the version of 100-28-DD on quality management, you had made some suggested revisions to that, and I think that it may be better to actually put that down with item 5 on the directive with quality assurance reviews, just to combine those issues. So that was in kind of review of your drafts. It did not look like 100-28 fit into the minor change category.
Okay, we can take a look at that. So with that amendment, then we agree that the agenda will be approved.
That's fine.
That's fine with me.
Thank you. So I don't remember that directive, Susan, but thank you.
I'll help with that when you come to it.
I don't remember what the change was. Okay. So the first 7 then, that would bring it down to 7 at the top, that y'all have minor changes or no changes, and we just need a vote to send those out for external review. I have looked at them, and I don't have any problem sending those 7 out for external review. Have y'all had an opportunity to look at them?
Yes. I don't have a problem with sending them out either.
And tell me again what it is I'm supposed to be looking at. I've got everything in front of me now.
The 7 directives. Okay, are you looking at the agenda?
I am.
Okay, so everything at the top under number 3 except 100-28 were minor changes. So we're not recommending any big changes in those. The staff have put their changes in, so if we can agree by general consensus that we go ahead and send those out for external review.
Okay, that's fine with me.
Sam?
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, item number 4 is a draft commission policy on executive limitations. And I think this one, because it's a commission policy, does not need external review. But there are a couple of things I want to consider with this policy. The first one is on, let's see how we're going to do this. Are y'all looking at the 90-page document or the 17-page document?
I'm looking at
I've got the 17.
Yeah, 17.
Okay. All right, in that case, it would be on page 2.
Okay.
Okay, so page 2 is good, and then if we can go on to page 3, it is highlighted in yellow, and it reads, policies will be defined as guiding principles and courses of action used to set direction for SCDDSN. Procedures will be defined as the step-by-step methods used in order to obtain compliance with the policies. Administrative directives that are policies according to this definition would require approval of the Commission. Administrative directives that are procedures according to this definition will not require approval of the Commission. So in the past, we have defined what the Commission will look at as significant, but the commission's definition and the staff's definition have varied widely in the past. So I think we begin to look at policies versus procedures, and this provides definitions as guidelines. Now, this is not a, we can change these definitions to say whatever we want them to say. But, for example, the 90 pages we got today, we had all those attachments. We had, all those policies with minor changes that we had already been sent once. I don't think we need to even see necessarily all of that. I think we need to put our focus back on the overall policy and, all the procedures that go toward helping the staff implement those policies that we agree on should not necessarily be decided by the commission. So I'd like for us to discuss that. Do y'all have an opinion?
You're referring to then those basically forms that would have been appendices to the policy that staff would be required to act on or complete in the process of carrying the policy out.
Right.
But,
right.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. To tell you the truth, a lot of I looked through those forms, but not being really privy to how the details of the thing work, I don't know that I'm qualified to offer an opinion on a lot of that.
And I feel the same way. I would ask either somebody on the commission or staff, just give me an example of an administrative directive that's a policy and an example of an administrative directive that's a procedure.
Commissioner Unum, this is Susan. So at the current time, when we refer to something as a directive, it really just refers to a body of documents that include policy statements and procedures together. So there may be some instances where a directive with a directive number would be constituted as purely policy. For instance, maybe if I look at the agenda items, the item on the directive on grant applications, for instance, it's just setting up a rule, which is a policy. Whereas many of these others in the sets that were on the agenda today have procedures within them. So at the current time, it's very difficult to differentiate that a certain directive is rather policy, falls in the policy list or the procedures list, because generally it's blended. We'd like to move in the future to separating them, but that's not currently what the body of directives looks like.
So does this language then help, or is this language kind of aspirational, but you still can't really do it because they're not separate?
I think it would be very difficult to implement it right now and follow it completely because the current directives are not written that way. It would be hard for us as staff to figure out which, we would have to do full rewrites, and that's a multi-year effort to separate the policy from procedure in all of the directives. I'm not saying it isn't right or it can't be done. It's just not instantaneous for that to happen.
No, but it's something that we can work toward. We're currently approving everything.
Yes.
So for example, we could start by the samples you send out. Like if you're calculating room and board and you're giving them formulas and samples and all that, we don't need to see all that. So the things that mostly forms that you're attaching, permission slips, if our policy is to provide privacy and your procedure is how you're going to go about making sure that information is maintained as private, then there's a difference in how you go about it. So I think we can help you with that all along the way and just try to, as we go through it, separate it. So if we need to say in the policy as we move towards separating policies and procedures, we want to be able to look at policies versus procedures as a policy committee or as a commission. But we have to start somewhere, and so I know I could immediately go through that 90 pages we were sent out yesterday evening and easily clear out 70. So I mean, it's not that difficult. One of the things with the thing yesterday was, if you've read the policy and it's minor, or it's, or if it's a procedure thing, or there are no changes in it, then it's ready to send out for external review. And we've had plenty of time to weigh in on whether or not we think there needs to be major change, or whether we want to make a major, or whether we think what you've said is minor is major. And if we don't come up and say that and put it on the agenda, then, then there's no point in resending it to us in a 90-page thing. I'm just trying to make it easier for us to zero in on what is important. You know what I'm saying? Now, you may be required FOIA to give out all those handouts at the meeting. I don't know.
What is our external review when you say send it out to external review?
For comment, public comment.
Yes.
Oh, okay. You don't mean like, I didn't know if we were sending it to some lawyer's office for review or something.
We send it to the provider network for public feedback, and then as you will recall, we have that special interest group email set that we send it to folks that have indicated an interest as we revise directive standards, etc. That we send it to as well. Okay. So they have 15 business days, and then we review their feedback and we incorporate them into the drafts.
Okay.
They're posted online as well, aren't they?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So why don't we just say that whoever the chairman of the policy committee is might help you differentiate and help you sort that through. I agree with you, it's going to be a process, but it's one that at some point in time we're going to have to start to separate some of this out, because we do get mired down in things that we don't have any business looking at. I would argue we don't have any business looking at policies either, but we do. So, we certainly don't need to look at how you go about implementing those policies in every little nook and cranny in the system. So I just think we need to start to separate and focus on the important policy setting parts of our job and let staff do some procedures. So the next time we have some up for review, let's take a stab at maybe, separating the two.
Commissioner Thompson, may I just get an additional clarification? So you mentioned that if there were directives with minor changes or no changes that staff could perhaps proceed just to putting those out for external review. Is that the procedure you'd like us to follow?
No.
From this point forward?
No, it isn't.
Okay.
That's a separate issue.
Okay.
What I'm talking about is the difference between a policy and a procedure.
I know.
So,
okay.
So if you think there's, or if we think there's policy in there, then we can go ahead with that. But there are times when we just don't need to see all those attachments because they're more procedural in nature. We could start there. Do you understand what I'm saying? A lot of the attachments that you send out have to do with how to accomplish that policy, and I would call that a procedure. So, but I can help you with that, and whoever the policy chairman committee is. And no, the reason, Susan, I think that we need to decide whether a change is minor or not is because, for example, on the quality assurance program, I don't know if those probably were minor changes that you made, although it could be debated because you are stepping up by reviewing more providers more regularly and taking a larger percent of the population. So your quality assurance program is changing and your risk management program is changing. I'd just like for it to change just a little bit more, but we don't always necessarily agree on what's significant and what's major. It was in the past, historically, the commission had a policy, it was actually in the meeting minutes of a commission meeting several years ago, that said anything significant would be brought to the attention of the commission. And then the Waiver Administration Division was created, and that was considered to not be significant, evidently because it wasn't brought to our attention. So we can't have something that subjective. It's going to have to be, there's going to have to be a definition. But anything that involves a procedure about how to meet a policy is something that I think the staff needs to be able to do and the commission should not need to have to do. So that's where I think we're headed with that first step. Now we can say, we can add to it if you're not comfortable that we're going to meet it, just send us everything you think might be a policy right now until we work through the process.
All right. Commissioner Thompson, as you're making that change, and I know the committee may have further discussion on that, that would then reflect a change, I believe, in some phrasing in item 14. So when you get to that, will you give that? I'm really referring in item 14 to the section that talks about submitting waiver manuals and policies. Because I think in some of the preparation for this policy committee meeting, there were several waiver manual changes that were those procedural changes. As item 14 reads right now, it would require all manual changes to come through. So if your desire is to differentiate those, that might be an item that needs some attention as well.
I agree with you completely, Susan, and those waiver processes, you sent us a set of waiver processes, basically, and procedures that really are really not that important for us to make a decision on, I don't think. And Lori and Sam, y'all tell me if you think they're right. But for example, the one policy about the digital stimulation changing because of the nurse advisory board making a recommendation, and they made that recommendation years ago. So now here we are, and we're trying to get ourselves into compliance with it, I guess because HHS wants to be in compliance with it. You basically already implemented that, right? You sent out a memo saying only a nurse can do this. Now, the reason I think that probably should have been discussed by us is because is there going to be a access to a nurse for everybody that needs that? Is there going to be a hardship on anybody because we're suddenly changing this requirement? And that is more of a policy. How you go about finding the nurse to do that is more of a procedure. So, if it's going to affect the population and it's going to change their access, then certainly I think we should weigh in on it. But to send it to us to review and vote on after you've already implemented it is not necessary.
So in that instance, if I might add, item 13 fell into play, that an interim policy when faced with a time-sensitive decision can be made, and then the circling back is with the committee and the commission, because that was a requirement. Now, we are unaware of instances where a nurse has delegated this activity to an attendant. That would be, according to our research, not a common thing to be delegated. But I understand your opinion on that, certainly, that the impact of it should be considered, and we did ask that internally and externally as well. But that's why that one was circling back, because of item 13, and then because of the fact that it was a waiver annual issue. So we were trying to be comprehensive there. So perhaps number 13 is something you all would also be willing to review and clarify a little bit.
Well, I think it's not time sensitive if the Board of Nursing ruled on it in 2006. Then why would you need to do it within 30 days before a policy committee meeting could be scheduled? I don't think number 13 was written for that. No, that's number one. And the other thing, if we're going to, that's, I think the thing about the nursing thing probably should have been brought to our attention. Maybe the environmental thing, how y'all do intake to meet the waiver requirement, that is all about process and procedures. We want to weigh in on what the waiver requirements are, but all this intake process stuff that you sent out, we don't really need to, those are procedural things.
Okay.
Vicki, this is Gary. I'm a little bit confused in terms of where we're dealing with what, and it's sort of definitionals. We're calling it policy and procedure, but at what operational level are we talking about having this review done in terms of, I'm still not clear how deep into the operations we're getting, because I mean, some of these questions, again, going back to the question about the nurses delegating for purposes of any sort of digital clearing or anything of that nature, where's the line between policy and operations?
Well, let me read you what definition I pulled together for this executive limitations policy, because obviously it's not in front of you, or I hope it's not because you're driving. So it says policies will be defined as guiding principles and courses of action used to set direction for SCDDSN. Procedures will be defined as the step-by-step methods used in order to obtain compliance with the policies. Administrative directives that are policies, according to this definition, will require approval of the Commission. Administrative directives that are procedures, according to this definition, will not require approval of the Commission. Now, there are going to be differences of opinion because there is some gray in there is some overlap, but not as much difference as there is between my definition of significant and your definition of significant. So, at some point in time, the Commission needs to set policies like in every other organization, and then the staff set the procedures about how to meet those. Now, you could argue that the digital stimulation one or something like that might be, what would our policy be then? I mean, to me, that's a policy issue. Only nurses will do this. It's a decision that's going to impact the service delivery system, even a little bit. And it may or may not impact access. We don't know because we weren't making a decision, and we didn't gather any of that data, but we don't even know how many people rely on that to deal with impaction issues. But at some point in time, we need to try to tease out some of these differences and just focus on what we need to focus on. So I would guess for now, moving forward, until we make those changes in every directive, that we get rid of, that we stop reviewing the attachments that have to do with how the staff is going to accomplish that objective or how providers are going to accomplish that policy that we set in that directive. But we need to begin to look at that definition and start making those differentiations at some point, because otherwise we will mire down.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of my concern, because the ultimate question becomes, how broad do you make the policy, or how over, policies can be set at all different levels, and simply calling something a policy because it affects the provider network or affects the delivery of services is that gives us pretty broad scope. I mean, I've served in places where the policies are very generalized, and then the operations and execution of that, a lot of discretion is given to the staff. And I've had other ones where there's been a more detailed control. And I think part of what we have to define is how deep into that control do we want to go as part of this process. That's my concern, is that I don't want to, I deal with vague statutes all the time in my career. I don't want to leave the staff trying to interpret us setting up vague gray area stuff, because I don't want somebody to come, I don't want 10 years from now somebody trying to figure out, do I need to take this to the commission or not under this standard. That's my concern, is that when you're gone and I'm gone, what is this going to mean to somebody if it's so vague that I can't get a handle on it? That's my concern. Anybody hear me?
Yeah,
hear
you just left us. You just left us speechless, I guess.
Oh, okay. I was just making sure I didn't drop the call. Sorry.
You've got a good point there. It's hard to know where the line would be drawn.
Have we taken a look at any other state agency regulations around this issue, or other states, DD agencies, language around this issue?
This is Vicki. I got cut off, so I have just rejoined the conversation, and I did not hear everything that Gary has to say. But to my knowledge, there aren't any they're not going to be that prescriptive to an agency. They're just going to say you govern, you set policies. And that's basically what ours says, that we're the governing board and we set policies. And that we administer the program. So, I think it's just going to be up to the commission what we decide at what level we need to go. And frankly, that's going to be determined in part by who's in charge at the helm. Because there may be instances where commissions in the future may feel that they need to be more prescriptive, and there may be occasions when they don't feel they do. But it has to be broad enough so that you can adjust it to the needs of the agency as you move through it. But I do think that sample documents, formulas for calculations, those kind of things are the procedure category, so that's a good place for us to start.
I mean, I think it's a good move to try to differentiate between policies, which we must review, and procedures, which we don't have to review. I think it's extremely difficult to craft language that captures that distinction and gives adequate guidance to the staff. I'm okay with this language if the staff feels like you can work with it, as long as we all understand that it's not 100% clear what falls into which category, and it's going to take some time to try to figure out what the commission wants to see and what it doesn't want to see. And it would be great if we could just survey some other state agencies. I mean, every agency, every board in the world surely deals with this issue of, the relationship between the commission or the board and the staff carrying out the board's direct policies. So
would it be helpful for us not to submit these 7 that we just voted to submit for external review and go back and look at those and try to separate them out, and then the commission go through every one of them to see if they're in agreement with what's being called? I mean, we don't need to make this labor intensive on ourselves. We can just take that paragraph out and look at every little thing they want to send us, like we have been. But I don't think we're moving in the right direction. I think at some point in time we have to get some momentum going so that we start to actually, the next time we draft up a policy or actually do the 3-year review on it, we separate it out and let the policy committee take a look at it and see if we agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not questioning, I'm not trying to build up more work for us. I don't feel like I have time to review what it is that we do need to review. I'm questioning whether we have language that the staff is comfortable with so that they know, all right, this clearly I should be submitting to the commission, and this clearly I don't have to submit to the commission. I just want to make sure we have language that captures that intent as best any language can.
Okay.
Lori said my thought much better than I said it. And maybe it is a matter of just having some examples within there, when we look and say, okay, we know that this is this and this is this. If we at least have some examples in there, it does kind of give some guidance if it's not exclusive, but this is what we're talking about.
Okay, you want examples included in that paragraph? I mean, do you have any language in mind, Gary? Or Lori, y'all are the attorneys. Do y'all have some?
I don't.
language that you think would be better?
I didn't, because in part, again, coming back to, I was a little bit hazy on exactly what we were dealing with. Yeah, the best examples that I can see so far is sort of what you've been talking about yourself, as far as examples of what we're looking at.
Well, I think we just have to start there, and then we can clarify as we go and just continue to look at everything until we say, okay, not this, but this, not that, but this. You know, and I don't know about putting examples. I mean, we can put examples in there, but it's still going to be gray because it's not going to cover every situation. So we have two options here. We can continue to look at everything and take the paragraph out, or we can leave the paragraph in until we have a better suggestion for wording, and then just identify policy by policy as we move forward what we would call, and have the staff make the attempt at separating the two on the next round of those to be reviewed.
Can I ask the staff in attendance your preference? Like, do you think this language gives you enough guidance, understanding that the commission or the policy committee chair would work with you? Or would you rather see us take another stab? I mean, give us your feedback.
I think it may put us in a situation where we could make an error because of the way the documents are set right now. However, if there's an understanding, or if we put in minutes that this will be trial and error and decided upon by close work with the committee chair, then maybe that would provide some comfort. You know, we always want it clear enough so we can understand it and do it without having to do a lot of mediation in between. So there will be a lot of discussion to shift. I think, as Commissioner Thompson said, obviously it will take some work. But, you know, we've talked internally about trying to split policy from procedure, and know we need to do that. So I'm definitely in support of moving in that direction, but there will be some growing pains to do it.
This was a project that I did do previously, and it was a multi-year policy in a small agency. It took us, but then we had a lot of other work to do, so it wasn't number one on the hit parade. We just did them as we went along and tried to get as many done in a year. But it took us 4 years to separate all our policies from procedures, and for the same reason that you're talking about doing it here. It allows you to make small changes and to make workflow better without having to pull it through a committee. But I'd hate to put something like, let's do trial and error in a policy. Mm-hmm. That's kind of troublesome to me. I would say we proceed as we're doing, and we mark it up on the way out, saying we believe this is procedure, we believe this is policy, and then see if you concur. And that's how we work it through. Still sending stuff through, but separating it and delineating what we believe is a procedure versus what we believe is policy. Now, the other thing comes up when the policy is not ours. In other words, the nurse licensing board is making a policy change. That is not up to us to say how we're going to do this.
Well, that wasn't a policy change. That was an advisory opinion in 2006. So, you know.
And on top of that, all these folks already have, to get the service in the first place, a nurse has to be, you can't delegate an action by a nurse unless there's a nurse involved. And the nurses always have to act under the Nurse Practice Act. So that has already been in place by the person who's ultimately responsible to do that. Whether or not it's in a waiver manual is really not the primary issue. The person is receiving what they need to do because the person that is delegating the activity is already is operating under her license and the rules and regulations that go with her license. So it just came out as an advisory from HHS in March. We put it on the March agenda, but then we didn't have a meeting. So that's why it was put on this one, to just bring it back up. That's the issue with that item. But I really believe that you can't put words in a policy that say we're going to do this by trial and error. So we might want to say... Here's the problem. The policy committee has met every month for a while now,
except March, we just got real lazy and didn't have a policy committee meeting in March. But I'm telling you, it is very difficult to look at procedural things that especially ones that you've already decided or you've already implemented. I mean, we need to be spending time on things and getting ahead, getting before it. Now, like I said, we can just continue to look at everything, but the direction of the way the commission sets policies needs to be provided by the commission. And by doing this, we are providing direction. But we can add a caveat that we will decide the difference, that we will look at it. If we don't like the definitions, we can't come up with a better definition, then maybe we should just continue to look at everything. But it is very labor intensive, and it's unnecessary in my opinion. So,
and I'm not disagreeing with you, Commissioner Thompson. I agree with you, actually. And that's why we did this where I previously was employed. We did separate them because I thought it was labor intensive and it slowed down the tweaking of small policy, procedural changes that would make workflow better for staff and for providers. What I think that we need to do is, like, going into it, maybe not make the change today, but start making the change in our practice as we send things out to you, and then we'll say, we believe this is procedural. If you concur, then we get closer and closer to that definition that everybody understands.
Well, I mean, I think we can leave it in with the definitions, and we can just say what you just said as an addition to it. That we can add to it that that the committee chair will agree that it is a procedure. So whoever the policy committee chair is would have to be in concurrence that this is a procedure, not a policy.
And then that way I'm sorry.
Takes the burden off the staff.
Well, and then that way, over time, I think what you're doing is that we're actually separating policy and procedure, and so over the course of a couple of years, it would not be that way anymore. You would have the policy coming through, because we would have already delineated the two.
Right. So what would the wording be on that, Mary? Added that.
Let me think about that. To get it in right.
In agreement, as the policies and procedures are differentiated, the commission policy chair will be in agreement that it does not need to come to the full commission. How about that?
Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll update it with what you just said and get that back out.
1042.
I can write it right now. As policies and procedures are differentiated, the commission policy chair will be in agreement that the agreement with the the commission policy chair will be in agreement with the staff on the definition of that particular policy.
And that way we'll be doing it over time and actually getting the task done just by going through the process.
Okay.
How about in the case of ambiguity between policy and procedure, the commission policy chair shall make a determination?
No,
I love
I think,
that.
well, I think that you might want to think about it coming back to the policy committee. If the two original parties can't agree on it and there's ambiguity, then that would be the one thing you bring to the policy committee and say, let's talk about this one. But it would sure narrow down that flow a whole lot, because a lot of it will be culled out at the beginning, and at the other end of that, process, like you're straining, and then down at the other end of the process, there'd be so much less brought to the policy committee where there's ambiguity or there's disagreement.
Okay, I was just trying to streamline the language a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm typing. I'll be there in a second.
Okay.
While you're typing, I'm going to leave the meeting for a minute, but I'll be back. This is Sam.
Okay.
Well, I feel like we're making an attempt here to make a difference in what we're looking at, so it's at least a start. Some of this stuff gets really involved. And a lot of it, you know, while Sam's gone to the bathroom, I'll make this comment. A lot of it probably ain't going to make any difference 5 years from now, because hopefully, you know, direct bill will be in place so significantly that ZDSN's role becomes more of oversight, and as an agency that sets policies too much for providers, it will not be necessary anymore. So a lot of this is going to go away on its own as ZDSN hopefully shrinks.
A lot of the procedure, particularly, will go away on its own. Yeah.
Right. Anybody else need to go to the bathroom, or are we just waiting on Sam?
How do we know that's where Sam is?
So maybe he just needed a drink of water.
This is Gary. I'm going to have to be getting off in just 1 second to go into my 11 o'clock. I apologize. But if you'll just forward me whatever, I'll review it before the commission meeting. I'm not a voting member of the committee anyway, so my presence here is fairly optional.
Do you want to hear before you get out of the car what we came up with?
Just send it to me. Literally, I'm getting out in like 2 seconds.
All right.
So I can get to the meeting. So just email it to me and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Gary.
All right. I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you. Okay, so he'll get it when the full commission gets it. But the way it's worded right now is, are you back, Sam? No. No.
I'm back. Is everybody still there?
Yep. We're sadly. Okay, so what we came up with is to add on to this paragraph, as the policies and procedures are differentiated, the commission policy chair will be in agreement with the staff and the category of each particular policy. In the case of ambiguity, the policy committee will make the determination of the policy versus procedure category.
That works for me.
Some pressure for everybody?
I'm good with it.
Okay, Lori?
Yeah, I was just trying to think if you should maybe say shall reach agreement with rather than will be in agreement with. Just, because you might not be in agreement with, will be in agreement. Is that how it was reading?
Yeah, the policy chair part?
Yeah.
Or the committee?
Yeah,
Or
shall
both?
reach agreement with. Right, because what we're doing is directing the policy committee chair and the staff to come to an agreement.
All right, so the commission policy chair shall reach agreement with the staff
Yeah.
and the category of each particular policy. In the case of ambiguity, the policy committee shall make the determination of the policy versus procedure category.
Okay. That's good.
Okay? Any other comments on that one?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, moving on down the line to the next page, which is page 3, Lori and Sam, of yours. Item number 15, I changed this morning the statutory code that deals with administration of federal funds and put the whole code in there rather than paraphrasing it, because I got to thinking about that paraphrasing might not be a good idea. So it just basically says the director, it has a lot to do with the conversation the commission had at the last meeting. I don't remember if it was an executive session or not, but anyway, this one goes, the director will submit relevant information to the commission concerning all changes being considered by SCDHHS that would affect the administering of federal funds. The programs covered by SCDDSN, including but not limited to 1, rates and proposed changes in rates, 2, billing methodology for providers contracted with DDSN, including recommending which agency providers are to bill for services, and 3, timelines of recommendation for program changes, billing changes, or rate changes. So I think as we move forward, it's going to be, just taking that part a second, it would be very important that we are made aware of any deadlines to convert to direct bill, and that will give us time to have more input into the planning of these kinds of transitions. So that's the purpose of the director submitting that information to us in detail. So moving on, it says, the director will also submit relevant information to the commission concerning all provider policy changes or corrections from entities contracted by DHHS or DDSN, including the Public Consulting Group, PCG, and Alliance. So my comment on this is that it is very important to me that we continue to grapple with final rules, and it's important to a lot of families and providers. We got a letter from Marion-Dillon County concerned that they were made to change their policies, and they are not comfortable with having a policy, for example, that allows residential consumers to have anyone over to spend the night. And I agree. That is, that is a dangerous thing. So when these people go in and say, I'm more concerned about rights and less concerned about safety or whatever, I just think that we need to weigh in on some of these decisions. The next part says the commission will vote on the proposed changes prior to requesting changes in policy from providers through compliance action plans or plans of correction. So we need to decide, do we agree with this? How far are we going to take the final rule? To my knowledge, the commission has not voted on any boundaries, has not weighed in on any requirements. And so, but as we go forward and we're still providing the oversight, then we at least ought to weigh in on what we think. Now, realizing that we're not the final say, but that we can make recommendations, because we need to get ourselves, to me, a little bit, if you've got a board like Marion-Dillon, and they're writing to all of our senators and congressmen and all that, because they're nervous. They're volunteer boards, and they're nervous about having to change their policies to say something that maybe they may think or may not think they can live with, because they're now protesting it to Washington, and we haven't even weighed in on it. Maybe we could save ourselves some grief here. I'm just thinking that we should decide. I know, Sam, you and I had a conversation about what was going on in New Jersey. You remember that?
Yeah. Vaguely.
Can you tell us a little bit about their experience with final rule?
No. I remember having the conversation, but I don't remember the details.
Well, you were saying that basically they had gone through what we're now going through.
Okay. You have a better memory for what I said than I do.
So, you know, a lot of states I know are going through this, but my opinion is, and you know, that we need to make recommendations on these things. That we do need to weigh in if we're going to be responsible for what happens and the outcomes, and things like the fences and things like the sleepovers and things like that are very troubling. If they're troubling to the providers who are doing the heavy lifting in this whole thing, then they ought to be troubling to us, and we ought to formulate some advice.
Can I ask a question, or do you want to go through the rest of it first?
No, go ahead. This is all about the recommendation part.
Okay, so just like in the Marion Dillon example, was it a federal rule that they were being asked to comply with? Because
Well,
I don't feel, huh?
That's a great point. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, we don't need to weigh in on anything that's a federal rule. And if they don't feel that they can comfortably comply with it, then what they should be doing is writing Washington and lobbying for a rule change. But it's what we think about it is irrelevant if it's a federal rule. So that I guess I don't know. I'm asking you honestly. You know, was it something in that case? Was it something that was federally mandated?
It's a case that is. Let me just tell you how I feel about that. It is a case where there's an interpretation of the final rule by PCG, and they are making these requirements, and the providers are mandated to do these plans of correction. Now, we are not involved in this at all. And, you know, as the governing board for every program that has anything to do with the people that we contract with to provide the service, you know, then we need to get between that somehow.
Okay.
I know that's a difficult position.
Well, yeah, what you said helped me a lot. I mean, there's a difference between them being asked to comply with a federal rule and them being asked to comply with a consultant's interpretation of the federal rule. And so I do not have any issue with us getting in there and opining on whether we think the consultant's interpretation is correct and required and all of that.
Commissioner Thompson, Commissioner Unum, let me just interject there. This is Susan. So as you know, the federal regulation is governing the provision of services for these waivers that we operate on behalf of DHHS. And so there are requirements according to those. Providers have received extensive information on if a requirement would cause undue risk or harm to an individual to go through an appropriate rights modification process. So I've not read the Marion Dillon letters, I've not received those, but I believe that that would be the appropriate process. Visitors are addressed through the settings rule. They absolutely are. And then somewhere in there also, PCG, Public Consulting Group, did not make recommendations. They merely did assessments and provided data. So we're not having PCG make any sort of requirements on providers. And Alliant completes reviews as really commanded from the agency on what to measure as well. So they're just data collection sources. They're not requiring things, but the federal funding has ties to it that requires corrective actions on certain issues or for protocols to be followed for rights modification if those requirements cannot be met.
And the individuals that live in the houses, they get to make their rules.
They can modify.
They can modify how they, if you get 4 folks living in a house that say, we don't want people staying overnight, or I want to be able to those rules and regulations on their own home. So I applaud Mary. If that's how they feel about it, they should be complaining to the feds, because that's who wrote this. And so they're doing the right thing as they see it. But there's plenty of mitigation in here as far as in those CAP plans on how to meet final rule expectations based on the needs and abilities and assessments that are done on the individuals that are living in those homes.
So we had in the Alliance standards some things that had to do with final rule that finally it was agreed that we would take those out and put them to the side. but that people still had to do corrective action plans on, which is the same thing as a plan of correction, so it was really just semantics. But before we decide as a governing board that we're going to make people take fences down, creating unsafe situations, we ought to weigh in on it. And therefore, our interpretation of it needs to be, we're going to go this far and no farther. And if anybody needs to be making those recommendations to the commission to say how we're going to get it, or to the HHS to decide how we're going to get in compliance with final rule, it should be the commission. The governing body needs to make those calls. Staff doesn't need to acquiesce if we're not in agreement that, you know, if we want to submit something that says we recommend that this, you know, we can take out whatever we want to in the Alliance standards. We just haven't done it.
We've put, those are not being looked at this moment. There's no plan of corrections required for any fences. And if a fence is there for decorative or safety issues, I think what we're looking at is fences that keep people in with like razor wire and just, fences that look institutional in nature and that do not allow a person to leave. But if it's there for a safety reason, there still needs to be a gate. Those, I mean, we're looking at the jail fences. We're not looking at neighborhood fences and things like that. We have not asked anybody to take a fence down.
What I'm saying is, well, there's corrective action plans that have gone on in the past year, and even though those things weren't really taken out of the standards, they were just moved to the side. But there was a corrective action plan that was made, and I don't want, and as I stated then when this was all going on, you know, I don't want an executive director out there to be of the impression that this is what we're expecting of them if it's not the right thing to do. I just think as a commission, we need to weigh in and make our recommendations. I don't think we can sit on the sidelines and have some of these things misinterpreted, dictated, assessed, data collected, corrective action plans written that we may not even be in agreement that we're ready or that we want that interpretation of the final rule. So some of our, I think we need to weigh in on final rule issues, and I think we need to come together as a governing body and say to HHS, this is our recommendation. I don't know why anybody would have a problem with that. Lori and Sam, how do y'all feel about making recommendations?
Would resolution be a better, you know, I liked Lori's term opine on a matter. We can have all the opinions we want and we can express them. And then, you know, another place where we could have a say would be, obviously, some of these things are interpretations, like in the Marion Dillon letter, they say it's our interpretation that, and so we could, you know, make a statement about whether we have a different interpretation or not, or whether we support their interpretation and have an equal concern. We can always opine, again, to use Lori's term, on matters like that.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ditto Sam. You know, if it's a matter of interpretation, I do think it's appropriate for us to have an opinion.
Okay, I do too. I don't think we should sit out on the sidelines and not weigh in on some of these things that are so troubling to so many people. And maybe we can be more specific with our recommendations. But, you know, there's some pretty broad things, and there are a lot of caveats that could be put in the final rule that we could actually maybe relieve some of the pressure on if we did weigh in and provided some direction, which I believe is our job. So that's really what we talked about last month. Let's weigh in and make our recommendations known.
I think the rub is going to be on what? Somebody has to decide what is merely an interpretation of federal law as opposed to just an application of federal law. And somebody's got to exercise discretion determining what needs to be brought to the commission as an interpretation of federal law.
Well, I think that's right, and that's why it's important that we put this in there as just to provide some kind of a guidance before staff go and put things in the standards for Alliant that may or may not, just to try to get in compliance with final rule that may or may not be clear enough or may not cause a problem for everybody if we don't at least weigh in on it and provide our guidance. So all this is saying is that we'll make recommendations things above.
One other issue I want to make sure, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say one other issue just as a point of clarification as well. So all the committee members are aware, for any of the waiver services, the standards that are developed are approved by the Department of Health and Human Services. So they are in effect their standards for the services for their waivers. Okay. So while opinion and recommendations certainly are definitely appropriate to consider, they are theirs to approve. So there may be situations where, because of their interpretation, a standard would still go into play.
Is there a mechanism for the submission prior to their adoption of standards for the submission of opinion from DDSN?
Yeah, we propose. Yeah. We propose.
Yes.
Okay.
Unless there's a required change coming from DHHS, then right. We generally develop a proposal that then they review and it gets mediated and finally approved.
Okay.
Who's we? Susan.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Who is we? We make recommendations for the standards. Who is we?
The policy staff works with DHHS staff to develop the drafts and to seek approval. And it goes through, for substantial issues, they certainly rise to, I'm aware of them before they go over, and then depending on the issue as well, we send it through executive staff here.
Okay, and so that's good then you can send it through us.
Okay.
Definitely.
So we can wait. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and that's fine as long as we just remember that the final rule is a federal rule from CMS, but there's lots of latitude in there how an individual organization can come into compliance, and it's really, if you boil it all down, there's those little things like can you have overnight? But yes, those were the boil apart, the flame throwing moments for folks. But the truth of the matter is, this rule is about hearts and mind. It's about how staff and organizations look at the folks that reside in their settings, whether it's a CTH2, a CRCF, or it is their day program, and that they optimize opportunity to be a member of the community and to make choices to the best of their ability. Of course, always keeping in mind health and safety, but so that you're not looking at someone who just goes day to day, not being a member of the community. That's what this rule's about.
As a whole, yeah.
And I have, I've come full circle from and I'm still a provider at heart, but just being that provider, trying to figure out, oh my gosh, how am I going to meet all these standards? How am I going to realizing that it's a matter of changing my training techniques. It's a matter of making sure my policies are in line with those training techniques and how I am trying to develop staff to understand that when a person says, can you please turn the music to R&B, I don't like country, that they actually get to hear the music on their own van, that is something they like versus what the staff wants. Ultimately, it comes down to being that simple.
Mary,
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for that. Let me just read a section of the code, of the state code, section 442250. And it says, the department shall develop service standards for programs for the department and for programs for which the department may contract, and shall review and evaluate these programs on a periodic basis. Get back to that shall word, Lori. But, you know, if we're not doing that and we're not weighing in on these things, then we're not making recommendations. We're just silent. And we can't afford to be silent about final rule. So what we're putting in the executive limitations policy, I realize it's different for staff to run things by us that have to do with that have been more told to the commission than discussed with the commission or asked the commission to weigh in on. But I think it's our job, I think it's our responsibility by state law, and I think we need to do it. And so I think, Susan, when you have those situations that you have to submit something to HHS for some kind of compliance rule or whatever else, we just make sure that we weigh in on that and make those recommendations as the governing body.
And so there is language in item 14 above about on that issue. Do you feel like that language incorporates what you're trying to go for here, as well as the earlier change about procedures versus policy?
No, I don't. I feel like that item 15, the one I've added, does.
Is there any way that there should be a policy on the commission's role in developing policy? Is the executive limitations policy the right place for all this? Because this is important stuff. Should it not have a policy of its own?
I don't have a problem adding it to the bylaws or anywhere else we need to add it, but I think it needs to be in this policy because you need to know and your staff need to know what your limitations are so that you know that it's your job to bring us this information and to get our recommendation on it before agreeing to it or passing it back. We want to make a recommendation on things that we think are going to affect. And standards are one of them. And if we had weighed in on those standards of a life, we might have avoided some problems.
And that's what I'm trying to say is if it was a policy, then I'd be following the policy. It wouldn't have to be something that was people were limited to. But there's a lot of good information in that, and it should be on its own. And it's not that because if it's a policy, I have to follow it. No.
I'd like to put it in there too. So let's just put it in. So the last one is the paragraph on if the commission determines that HHS conditions are not feasible for the administration of the program or not in the best interest of the consumers and their families, the commission will outline its conditions for operating the programs to South Carolina HHS. If HHS is unwilling or unable to remedy the conditions, then DDSN Commission may notify HHS of its unwillingness to administer the program.
I mean, do we have the statutory authority to decide what we're going to administer and not administer?
Well, again, this is because DHHS is the state Medicaid agency, and that's how our money flows through them.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, we'd be saying that, you know, we're not going to take the money. And then what happens to the programs that says we are supposed to have and run and take care of the folks that we serve? I think it's setting up a very dangerous precedent.
Well, we already set up the precedent. We already did set up the precedent. We did that 2 years ago when we said we cannot operate the PDD program with the behavior support rate at what it was because we were not able to enroll children because of the lack of providers. And so the commission did not agree to operate that program. We really didn't have another choice.
Sorry. I figured that's what you had in mind, Vicki. As I understand it, that was before my time, but that was at the time that the PDD waiver, the federally funded part of that program, was discontinued. So all that was remaining was the PDD program, the state-funded part, in which case, yes, we've got the authority to say yes or no, we want to do this or we don't. But if it's a federally funded Medicaid waiver program, I'm just questioning, do we have the statutory authority to say that we're not going to run a federally funded Medicaid waiver program, the funds for which flow through AHHS?
It's done through contract.
Let me jump in here and see if I can give a different perspective.
Okay.
When it comes to the policies we're talking about, we propose policies, HHS accepts them. There's a partnership here, but at the end of the day, we get a bite at the apple for the policy. So there is no doubt we can run policies through the commission. It's just a matter of bandwidth of you able to keep up. So the answer is we can do that under the current conditions. And if HHS gets them and they disagree with them, then they'll tell us so, and then there's an editing process. I think it's a capacity to do it. That's the first issue. We can do it. It's just a matter of horsepower. When it comes to the rate, I don't think the rate is logically. This policy doesn't affect, I think, the real world rate, where they don't propose rates to us. They give us rates. And I agree, last 2 years ago, it was the rate on autism, and we could accept it or reject it, and we rejected it. So I don't think there's a negotiation with the rate, because the statewide plan has a methodology, and they implement a methodology, and they do all their input in public forums and math, and they come up with a rate. So when they do a rate, there is no proposed rate to us. It's the rate.
Well,
so we can accept it or reject it. My last point is on the point of accepting or rejecting it. And I think this is kind of I would call an institutional decision. If we reject rates and don't provide services, South Carolina HHS has other options. Okay, so we, in many respects, are a subcontractor on this. So if they say you don't like our respite rate and you don't like this rate, they have the capacity, as they demonstrate on autism, to do something else. So I think we can. I am just bringing up the topic of by making such a pointed either or type requirement here, I think we're kind of inching ourselves toward a decision that is not an either or decision. This is a partnership, and I think that everything that we do informally every day, I think we can absolutely meet a commission's need to be informed, to approve, with the exception of the rate, and whether we accept. I don't think this is a piecemeal program. I think this is a waiver program that has many, many, many different services. I don't think we can pick and choose which ones we want to do and not do. So I caution us that when we start getting into this nitty-gritty detail, that we realize the bigger picture of how this relationship works, our roles and responsibilities. I am 100% behind getting everything to the commission and weighing in, but there's a bandwidth issue. One of the issues here is weighing in on the CAP programs, policy changes. We have 50 caps and probably 1,000 policy changes. We're not out there mandating policies. We're just trying to get their policies to conform with the final rule. And there's probably 5 different policies that would fit a final rule form. And so we're trying to make them compliant. We're not demanding them doing it, because at the end of the day, if they don't do it, they won't be Medicaid certified and they won't get Medicaid funds. So there is this very delicate balance. It's not a delicate balance, it's just business. So I think when we start to regulate with this type of precision, it could come off as kind of a, we have the right to veto anything you want. If we ever get to the point of vetoing yes or no, I think we have lost the war. So I caution us that when we go down this road of what the commission wants, I think we should provide you all the information you need, but I read this and I don't like the tone of it, quite frankly. The tone comes across as either or. And if we get there, they have options. I saw a PowerPoint from HHS where, they're going to look at some point in the future, they're going to look at managed caring our population. And at that point in time, I would hope DDSN has such a great product on the field that they'll look at our system and our relationship and say, you know what, we want to stay with those guys. But we've got to earn that relationship. We got to build that relationship. We got to build all the processes to make that work, that they want to keep on working with us. They don't have to work with us. Hope that helped a little bit.
That helps a lot,
Pat.
Pat. Thank you for that. And I agree with you. I don't, DHHS conditions are not feasible. Vicki, again, I knew when I read this, I knew you were thinking about the PDD program, and I just think that was a little bit of a different scenario than what we're typically in. I do think that we have a right and an obligation to make our voices heard when rate changes are being proposed, but it's not after they have established the rates. It's like right now. Like, for example, I happen to know that Josh Baker is looking at the ABA rates again right now. So our commission, and maybe this is where we need our lobbyist help, our commission should be weighing in on those rates right now. And from what I've been told, he's looking at like a 4% or a 7% increase, which will still put us at the very bottom of state rates. So now is the time that we should be taking a position on behalf of our consumers.
Let me just say the reason that I wrote that paragraph in there, and it doesn't say we will, it says we may. But anyway, the reason that I put that in there is out of desperation. As a commissioner, you become weary after a while of deadlines that are set, like for case management, lack of planning that goes into it, the whole situation where who's going to bill to who. In other words, why are the providers not billing directly to HHS for this case management program? Now, is it because they're not ready with their system, which is like, well, why isn't their system ready? Health centers bill directly, nursing homes bill directly, but providers can't bill directly. But as I understand it, they're supposed to be able to bill directly to HHS. And does that affect the rate? In other words, DDSN is supposed to be getting some administrative rate that is supposed to be separate from this. But I know that in the past, HHS has gone back to CMS and asked for rate increases. They don't always get them. But we should be in there advocating, recommending those rate increases. Like you just said, Lori, we need to be front and center on that, and we need to be saying this is what we've got to have to effectively run these programs. And so I want us to weigh in on who they bill, how much they bill, all those recommendation things that we said in the past. But I want to avoid in the future, any future commissioner having to come in and just live with whatever is decided that they're going to be responsible for. You can have all the responsibility in the world, but then you should be able to have a say in it. You should have some authority that goes along with that responsibility. I understand the relationship.
We lost you.
But it's just we can leave that paragraph off, and I expected, that we probably would at the end of the day today. But I wanted to throw it out there because there are choices. HHS has choices about who they contract with, and we have choices about what we're going to accept responsibility for. And some of the things that I have seen done poorly in terms of planning and getting ready to do something, and you know, you've got a case management situation where no provider in the state has demonstrated that they can do it on that system, and then you're going to say, well, we're going to have a plan to do it, which we had to ask for that. You know, let's at least get that information from the providers. But the inflexibility of the July 1st deadline has really struck me as being something like, well, you know, maybe they don't want to operate this case management program July 1st. Maybe they don't have the software to operate this program July 1st. I don't know. But as our role shifts more to oversight, and we need to get ourselves out of the middle of some of these things. If I were able to make a recommendation as a commissioner on behalf of my constituents, I would say, y'all need to bill HHS directly. The money, what I'm interested in is the money going to the people it's supposed to. And, you know, I've heard conversations about we've got to keep DDSN relevant. That's not in our mission statement. So what we have to focus on is the money getting to where it's supposed to go to, and, you know, and it being, and us weighing in on these things and saying, can we operate the programs for this? Are they going to get the services they're supposed to be getting for this? And lobby the heck out of it to get the match for whatever we need to get it to what it needs to be. So I am completely, having said all that, I want you all to know where I'm coming from on this. It is because, Pat, we haven't exercised the recommendations that you said we could exercise above, and we have gotten ourselves into a corner a number of times in the last 4 years that I've seen. So we can take that paragraph off and hope and try that if we make those recommendations, we will be heard and we can maybe have some input as a governing board of these programs that we have not had in the past.
Vicki, let me just, we're going to end on an agreement note here, because some of the issues that happened last year was the pace of activity was like you described. A lot of things were moving fast in final rule. We were modifying policies, sending them over to HH, they were approving them, and if we had had this policy rule we have now, you would have seen that traffic and you would have had a bite at the apple before they went back over there. And some of those policies that kind of got us in the jam, such as the fence issue, it was just a poorly worded standard. So we do need more eyes on these standards. I think they were a little casual, and we can make them more practical. That would be in our best interest and HHS's best interest. When it comes to the money, I think the people who have been beating the drum for 5 or 6 years, we're right on the money. We are on the cusp of getting rates from the Mercer report that are 100% pass-through. Whatever the rates are, they're going to go right to the provider. So as a result, that we have to change our payment system so that we get out of the middle of those rates, so that people can see those rates, and that in the out years, when it comes to keeping those rates healthy and matched with market conditions, so providers can be healthy and consumers can get services, it is so much easier to justify rate increases when you can see 10 separate increases. And as an agency, the band system kind of inhibited our ability to really be advocates for individual rates because everything was tied to each other. And so we are on the right track on the rate issue. And as far as whether they can bill direct or not, I think once we go fee for service, I got some HHS guys in here. Their MMIS system probably at some point in time can accommodate. And at that time, the question is going to be, do they want to grab the ball and take the match, or will our TheraP system be equal to the task? And that is a decision that's probably 2 or 3 years out, but with all technology, we cannot bank, no offense to you guys, we can't bank on future technology solving our problems. We got to solve our own problems. So I think that's a legitimate issue, and nature's going to take its course at some time in the future. But I'm very optimistic that the rate issue, the ability to see what we're doing and argue for higher rates, but we have to be here to argue for higher rates. You know, we don't have much vision on the autism rate because we've lost connection to it.
That's right. And the current case management rate that was decided
14.
before our time is a pass-through rate. So that's between $60 and $100 an hour for case management. It's really more of a mindset change that you've got to bill now in 15-minute units, and to also get used to the new service of waiver case management, which will be
I
in
don't
their
like,
hands.
Mary,
Which will be
I don't want to go back into that debate on this policy because we got several other we got to do.
Well,
But-
and I'm sorry, but I have to get off the phone. I thought we were only scheduled for an hour, and I have an 11:30 meeting that I have to, or conference call that I have to be on. So I really
So let's
apologize for that.
Okay, so let's just finish this up. Are we, as the policy committee, in agreement to take off that last paragraph?
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
And also, the paragraph that, just something to think about, relevant information to the commission concerning requests for provider policy changes or corrections from entities contracted, including PC. I mean, that is very, very specific.
They don't do those things.
I mean, we're not going to be working with PCG again, and it's in the
Done.
policy. I mean, do we want to get that specific in here, or just want to say all, and, I mean, what do you have to say?
We can say all entities contracted is fine with me because we're just talking about recommendations. I just want to make sure we look at those standards next time. Okay?
I think we got to address the cap thing too,
Yeah,
because
right, yeah.
that is logistically
There would be thousands.
thousands. I propose change that language that we're not going to make anybody change their policies. We're just going to tell them that the policies that they have are not consistent.
That's right. It's
And
up to them to change
Up to
them.
them to change. So I don't want us to be perceived as bullying them into changing policies. We're just trying to get them compliant.
Mm-hmm.
Because we literally would have thousands of policies. We're trying to
Well,
help.
you have to accept their plans of correction or their corrective action plans. So you are doing it to an extent.
It's a compliance action plan because they're trying to come into compliance with a new rule. It's not that we're correcting something that's already out there. It's a new way of thinking, and to do that, some people don't have to change a policy because none of that's in their policies. What they're doing is they're changing training. So it really has to do with, it's very agency specific, and I don't quite think that we can, how many people are they going to need to do that?
Lori, are you still on?
Commission of Audit.
I am, but I really do have to hang up. I'm sorry, but it sounds like we're not going to be able to take a vote on this because there's still some language, and I have to get on this other call. So I'm happy to get on another call before the next commission meeting, but I gotta jump off.
Can we just take out what they're talking about they have a problem with and pass it without that paragraph?
Two paragraphs.
I'm good with that.
It's the two paragraphs directly after that bullet that says timelines, I think, that we're talking
I
about.
know, there's no.
The director will, and then the commission will vote on proposed changes.
Shall
make recommendations to DHS concerning the implementation of
make
operation of all
recommendations.
programs that operates.
Okay, so Lori and Sam, are you there?
Yeah.
I am.
All right, we're taking out the PCG and Alliance sentence. We're taking out the commission will vote on the proposed changes, and we're taking out the last paragraph.
Okay.
All right.
And I'm good with that.
All right. So, do I have a motion to pass it with those changes?
So moved.
I don't know, is that the same one?
Is that the same one?
We have a second.
The commission will make recommendations concerning the implementation and operation of all programs that operate. So we can't do anything about all programs HHS operates.
Okay, we're talking about commission programs, Mary. So, all right. Are there any objections to the rest of
Wait a minute. Commission will make recommendations to DHHS concerning the implementation and operation of all programs DDSN operates.
DDSN operates.
Yes, CDSN operates.
All right, can we replace it with DDSN and then I'll be okay?
Yep, we can.
Okay.
Okay. We have a motion and do we have a second?
Yeah, with that change, I'll second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Okay, meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
You.
Bye.